If I could only fish with one lure for the rest of my life, it would be a jig. A jig, in my opinion, is one of the best lures that we have to go out and catch big bass consistently. Sure, you have lures like big swim baits that can also catch really big bass, but they're just not as consistent as a jig. And the other thing that I love about a jig is just how versatile of a lure it is. You can fish it in really deep water, you can fish it in really shallow water, and everywhere in between. But there is one thing about a jig, and I'm not talking about color, I'm not even talking about the hook that's in a jig, that I think is the very most important thing that you need to pay attention to when you're out there fishing. And today I want to talk about that. So stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. No matter what brand of jig you like, maybe you like Strike King jigs, maybe you like Freedom Tackle jigs, War Eagle jigs, Berkeley jigs, you can typically find some of the best prices at sportsmansoutfitters.com. And for you anglers who also like to hunt, we're kind of in the hunting season right now, and you can find a lot of your hunting equipment at Sportsman's Outfitters as well. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, you can click those links down below in the description and shop at Sportsman's Outfitters today. A number of years ago, I was fishing a local tournament here in Ohio. Now, if you are from Ohio, this was a part of the Mega Bass Tournament series, and my partner at the time was actually unable to fish this one event. This was the first event of the season, and he had a prior obligation. So he was unable to fish it. I reached out to a couple of other guys who fish tournaments, and nobody could fish this particular tournament. Everybody was fishing elsewhere. And so I decided that I was going to go ahead and fish this tournament by myself, which I don't always know is a good idea, because if you're fishing in a team tournament by yourself, like you are at a disadvantage right off the get-go. But I wanted to fish it, and so I went ahead and did, and I'm really happy that I did so, because I learned something so critical about fishing jigs that day. Something that I have been able to use no matter where I go in the country, you know, whether that's Florida or New York, Michigan, Alabama, Mississippi, no matter where I have gone, this one thing about jigs has really helped me to catch a lot more bass on them. Now, like I said, this was the first event of the season. So it was in the springtime. The bass were starting to move up into the shallows and really starting to spawn. Now, I had fished this lake the day before, kind of to practice for this tournament, and found that the water temperature was kind of in the upper 50-degree range. And I also found that I was catching some fish on a jig, and the few fish that I caught were good ones. So I decided I was gonna lock a jig in my hand, fish it all day, and see what happened. At this particular lake in Ohio, like most Ohio lakes, it's pretty small. And there were a ton of guys in my area come tournament day. When I got into that first place I wanted to fish, there was a lot of guys that were already in there. I mean, and this was a small canal system. There was probably 5, 6, 7 boats in that area, but we were all basically circling each other, fishing a lot of the same water. And something that I noticed that day was that a lot of the other anglers who were in that event and in that exact area were also fishing jigs. They were all fishing like the same thing. We were all fishing jigs, soft plastics, and it just seemed ridiculous to me that we were all doing the same thing. But in this tournament, I was actually able to catch my 5-fish limit, and I actually placed third in this event by myself out of around 40 teams. So I was really excited about that, and I was also really shocked, because I thought that everybody in that area was catching a lot of fish. And lo and behold, kind of after this event, after I talked to some of the guys that were fishing in that same area, they were telling me that they weren't catching a ton in this particular area that I was fishing. A lot of these guys were telling me that they were fishing jigs that were 3/8 of an ounce or a 1/2 ounce. You know, that's a pretty typical jig size that we all fish, from 3/8 to 1/2 ounce. Now, the jig that I was fishing in this event was actually a 1/4 ounce jig. It wasn't necessarily a finesse jig, because it has a beefier hook on it, and still it has a full skirt on it. It was just a lot lighter in weight than what these other guys were fishing. And the only reason that I decided to pick up that 1/4 ounce was because the night prior to the tournament, we had a little bit of a cold front come through, and I just thought that maybe a slower fall would help me to get another bite or two. But I didn't realize that that was everything. That was the reason why I was able to go behind guys in this particular tournament and catch fish, even though they had just worked an area extremely hard. I remember literally talking that the tournament director in this tournament was fishing the same area, and he had just gone down a bank and said that he worked it as slow as he could, picking it apart. I went right behind them and actually caught the biggest bass of the day for me, which was like a 3-pounder right behind them. And I remember seeing him feel so deflated inside. But the reason that I got that bite and he didn't was simply because I was fishing a lighter jig that has a slow fall rate. And that, guys, is what I want to talk about today, is fall rates. Fall rates to me, not only when you're fishing a jig, but also when you're fishing baits like a Texas rig, can literally be everything. Like I just described in that story, in that example that happened to me, it was the difference between catching fish in an area and not. Now, I don't necessarily think that every time you go fishing that a fall rate is going to make a big difference. I think that there are days when you go out there, maybe 75% of the time, 80% of the time, that if you're fishing a 3/8 ounce jig or a 1/2 ounce jig or a 3/4 ounce jig, you're probably going to get the same amount of bites because it just looks like what the bass are eating. But there are days, like what I just talked about, where it means everything. Having that slow fall rate just gives those bass a lot more time to get that bait. It's also not intrusive. It doesn't just come down on them and smack them in the face in that little bit colder water. It's something that they can just kind of see as it's coming down, go over there and grab. Now, on the complete opposite side of things, I have also seen that during the summer, when you are fishing in really hot water conditions, that you also might want the opposite of things. You might want actually a really heavy jig. Instead of fishing that typical jig that's 3/8 or 1/2 ounce, stepping up to a 3/4 or even 1 ounce weight will also make the difference on you getting bites and not, because you are actually creating a reaction strike. A lot of bass see that same size jig and all of a sudden you have a 1 ounce jig that just plummets right in front of their face. They just can't help but bite it. They can't help but react to it. Now, obviously the weight of your jig is going to be the biggest dictator on how fast that jig falls. Like we've been talking about, the difference between a 1/4 ounce jig and a 1/2 ounce jig. So it's very important that you know the weight of your jigs. And I have talked about this on other videos before. I like a number of jigs, but one of my favorite jigs is a Freedom Tackle jig. And the biggest reason that I like it is simply because on the head of that jig, it tells me the exact weight of that jig. Because if you're like me, I take my jigs out and I throw them into some sort of Plano style tackle box. And sometimes if I don't have it labeled, I might forget how big that jig is. And then you're sitting there trying to compare the head sizes and figure it out. So having a jig on the back of it that says exactly how much it weighs, I really like it just so that I know, hey, this is going to fall faster or slower. Now, another thing that can really impact the fall rate of your jig is the trailer that you go with on the back of your jig. You know, for me, there's really two main trailers that I like to fish. You know, one is a crawl style trailer that has legs as it falls. It kind of goes like this. And the other one is more of a beaver style trailer. Now, this doesn't have a lot of action. It doesn't catch a lot of water. So that crawl style trailer, if you were to put a crawl on a 3/8 ounce jig and a beaver on a 3/8 ounce jig, that beaver is going to fall faster than the crawl, because again, the crawl is catching water, it creates drag, and it slows that bait down. So it's just very important to know that the trailer you go with is going to impact your fall rate. Another thing that really impacts your fall rate is how much skirting material that you have on your jig. A lot of jigs, when you get them fresh out of the package, come with a lot of skirting material on them. Now, if you leave all that skirt on there, it's again going to create more drag, more resistance as it falls through the water. So a big skirt tends to fall a lot slower. Now, if you trim that skirt up, maybe you shorten it up, maybe you actually thin it out a little bit, that again is now going to fall faster because there's not as much skirting material. So at the end of the day, it's just extremely important to know the fall rates of your jig. And it's also really important to test this out when you're out there on the water. If you are starting to get on a jig bite, this is something that I do all the time, whether it's a jig or a Texas rig. If I am on a Texas rig or jig bite, I am actually going to rig up a few of them if I can. If I can rig up 2 rods with jigs on them or 3 rods with jigs on them that are all different weight sizes, that will help me to figure out what exactly the bass like. If I'm getting a lot more bites on a 1/4 ounce, I'm gonna stick with a 1/4 ounce. If I'm getting a lot more bites with a 3/4 ounce, I'm going to obviously stick with the 3/4 ounce. So the fall rate of a jig to me is the most important aspect of a jig, especially when you're fishing in cold water. Now, speaking of cold water, I did a video right here where I talk about fishing jigs in cold water from the bank. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I think you will like this one as well. Please comment below, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next video.